A pilot refuses to take off with a black girl. Seconds later, he realizes her father owns the airline. What would you do if you were treated unfairly, dismissed by someone just because of how you looked or your age? Imagine being denied something as simple as boarding a flight, not because of anything you did, but because of who you are. Now, imagine the moment when you find out the person who rejected you has no idea who they're really dealing with. This story is about a young girl, only 10 years old, who faced that exact situation. But instead of staying silent, she chose to stand up, and what happened next will surprise you. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The busy terminal of Harlem International Airport buzzed with activity as passengers from all over the world made their way through security, waited in long queues for their flights, and strolled toward their respective gates. The clink of luggage wheels on the smooth, polished floors blended with the hurried steps of businessmen, the joyful chatter of families, and the soft hum of announcements over the PA system. In the midst of this, a young girl, Liana, stood by herself in the long line for boarding. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about her. A 10-year-old girl in a neatly pressed dress, clutching a small bag in one hand and a boarding pass in the other. Her shoes, polished and matching perfectly, tapped quietly as she stood there, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a certain innocence and curiosity only a child could have. She was, however, far from ordinary. Liana wasn't just any child. She was the daughter of Mr. Morton, one of the most influential businessmen in the country, the owner of Harlem Airlines, and a man whose name was synonymous with success and power. Yet, Liana never let her father's wealth define her. She was independent, polite, and thoughtful. Today, as she prepared to board the flight to their family's estate, she felt a quiet excitement, even if she was traveling alone for the first time without her father at her side. She clutched her boarding pass tightly, feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation. Her father had secured the seat for her in first class, an arrangement they often used when Liana had to travel alone. This wasn't her first time flying, but today felt different. The thought of being away from her father, even for a few hours, made her anxious. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself as the line moved forward. Ahead of her, the flight attendants were busy with last-minute preparations, ushering passengers toward the aircraft. As Liana approached the gate, she saw Captain Davies, the flight's pilot, standing with a steely expression, chatting briefly with the crew. His tall frame and sharp uniform were instantly commanding, and there was an air of authority about him that made Liana stand a little straighter. She had seen pilots before, but for some reason, today something felt off about him. She approached the boarding area and handed her boarding pass to the gate attendant. The young woman at the desk glanced at it, smiled, and handed it back. Liana was almost through when Captain Davies's voice, cold and blunt, rang through the air. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, turning toward her. "What's this?" Liana paused, her hand still holding the boarding pass in the air. "This is my ticket," she replied, offering it more confidently than she felt. "I'm sorry, but I don't see your name on this list. This is a first-class seat, and you don't look old enough to be flying alone," Captain Davies continued, his voice harsh and dismissive. Liana blinked, surprised. "But I have my boarding pass. I'm supposed to be on this flight." Captain Davies glanced down at the pass again, this time more dismissively. "I don't care what it says. You're not flying alone on my watch. Go to the back of the line." Liana's heart skipped. She had never been treated this way before. Her eyes widened, and she felt a knot form in her stomach, but she didn't argue. She had learned from her father to always remain composed, no matter the situation. She looked up at him again, this time with a little more courage. "Please, sir," she said, her voice steady but small. "I'm supposed to be on this flight. My father booked it for me. Please let me board." Captain Davies didn't even glance at her as he waved dismissively. "I don't care who your father is. You're not getting on this plane until someone confirms that you're on the list." Liana's eyes burned, but she didn't want to cry. She had learned early that tears didn't help. She took a deep breath and looked toward the gate attendant, hoping that the situation could be cleared up quickly. But the attendant, clearly uncomfortable, avoided her gaze, instead focusing on the paperwork in front of her. The minutes felt like hours. Liana stood there, waiting, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced, trying to think of a solution, but there was nothing she could do. She couldn't fight him, not now. Captain Davies's words echoed in her ears as he walked away, muttering something about needing to get the flight started. Liana was left standing there, her small shoulders sagging slightly, but still standing firm, refusing to let the humiliation show. Liana knew her father would never let this happen. He was always there, always making sure she was safe and comfortable. She quickly pulled her phone from her bag and dialed his number, trying to keep the tears at bay. "Hello," came her father's voice, warm and soothing. "Dad, there's a problem," Liana said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The pilot won't let me on the plane. He says I can't fly alone." Her father's voice hardened instantly. "Stay where you are, Liana. I'll be there in a minute." Liana knew her father wouldn't take kindly to this. She could almost hear him shifting into business mode, the man who controlled empires and who wouldn't let anyone undermine his family. The thought brought her a sense of calm as she stood there, looking up at the plane, feeling small and invisible. Captain Davies took one last glance at her before walking back up the steps into the cockpit. Liana took a steadying breath. She had been taught to stand tall, no matter what, and even though she was only 10, Liana knew her father would make things right. The seconds stretched almost painfully as Liana waited by the gate. The bustling airport around her seemed distant now. Its noise, its hurried steps, its distant voices all faded into a blur in her mind. She could still hear Captain Davies's voice, cold and dismissive, ringing in her ears. "Go to the back of the line." Those words felt heavy, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She looked at the plane once more. It seemed so far away now, its belly filled with passengers who would soon be airborne while she stood alone, unwanted and ignored. The other travelers passed by, not giving her a second glance. She wasn't just a 10-year-old girl to them. She was invisible. But Liana knew better. She knew her worth, even if others didn't. As she stood there, fingers clenched around the edges of her small bag, her mind drifted to her father. She could hear his voice in her head, the calm, authoritative tone that was always so reassuring. "Don't worry, Liana, we always handle things with grace." Her father, Mr. Morton, had always told her to take things in stride. He believed in staying composed, in handling every obstacle with poise. But as she felt the sting of Captain Davies's judgment, she realized how hard it was to stay composed when the world didn't see you as you truly were. Her fingers gripped the phone tightly as she stared at the gate. "Dad, please hurry." Her father was always there for her, but now she was on her own. She could only hope that the seconds ticking by were enough for him to come to her rescue. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the familiar sound of a phone ringing broke the quiet tension. Liana's heart leaped as she pulled her phone from her bag. It was her father's name on the screen. She didn't even hesitate. She pressed the button to answer. "Dad," Liana said, her voice small but resolute. "He won't let me on. The pilot, Captain Davies, he's making me leave." A long pause followed, and Liana could almost hear the wheels turning in her father's mind. Mr. Morton was not a man who took such things lightly. Liana felt a sense of calm wash over her as his voice came through the phone, sharp yet reassuring. "Stay exactly where you are, Liana. I'm coming." With that, the line went dead. Liana leaned against the wall, feeling a sense of relief, yet still consumed by an undercurrent of anger. She knew that when her father arrived, things would change. People respected him. They feared him. He was the man who owned Harlem Airlines, who ran one of the biggest business empires in the world. Liana had always admired his strength, his ability to command respect effortlessly. But now, standing alone at the gate, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had just experienced. She looked toward the cockpit again, where Captain Davies had disappeared. What was he thinking? Did he feel any remorse for the way he treated her? Liana doubted it. She had learned early that not everyone would treat her the same way because of her skin color or because of who her father was. That much was clear. But she knew her father wouldn't let this slide. He never did. And that gave her strength. The few minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Liana stood, her feet aching from standing still for so long. But her eyes remained fixed on the gate. She was determined not to let her disappointment show. She wanted to appear calm, collected, the way her father would expect. But inside, she was seething, confused, and hurt. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the tension. Liana looked up. "Is this where Liana Morton is?" a man asked. The voice was deep, but there was no mistaking it. This was no ordinary airport staff member. Liana recognized the air of authority in his tone. She turned to find a tall, well-dressed man standing at the entrance to the gate. He had sharp, almost commanding features and a presence that immediately made people notice him. Liana felt a flicker of recognition, and her heart skipped. Mr. Morton, her father, was here. In an instant, the man's eyes scanned the scene. He locked eyes with Liana, giving her a small, reassuring nod, then turned to the gate staff with a piercing look. Without a word, he strode over to the staff member who had been standing at the desk, fumbling with some papers. "Where is the pilot?" Mr. Morton asked, his voice low but carrying weight. The staff member hesitated before pointing toward the aircraft. "He's on board, sir. But there's a situation, a young girl." "I know," Mr. Morton interrupted, his tone now hardened. "Where is he?" The gate staff member seemed to shrink under the force of his gaze. "He's inside, preparing for takeoff, sir." Without another word, Mr. Morton turned, his eyes locking onto Captain Davies as he approached the aircraft steps. Captain Davies stood at the top of the stairs, speaking with a few of the flight attendants. When he saw Mr. Morton approach, he stiffened, clearly recognizing the figure coming toward him. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Mr. Morton's voice was calm, but it carried an unmistakable edge. Captain Davies swallowed, suddenly unsure of himself. He straightened, trying to maintain his composure, though the sudden unease in his stance was clear. "I'm sorry, sir. There's been a misunderstanding," Captain Davies began, trying to hide his nervousness. "I couldn't allow this young lady to board. She wasn't on the manifest." Mr. Morton raised a brow, his eyes narrowing. "And you decided to deny her entry based on what, exactly?" Captain Davies cleared his throat, but it was obvious his confidence was faltering. "She's a child, traveling alone. It didn't seem right." "I didn't ask for your opinion on that," Mr. Morton snapped. "She is my daughter." A pause hung in the air. Captain Davies looked from Mr. Morton's face to the young girl standing by the gate, realization slowly dawning. His eyes widened as the truth hit him like a freight train. The very child he had refused to let aboard was the daughter of the very man who owned the airline. Liana felt a strange mix of anger and relief wash over her. She had known something like this would happen. She had known her father's reputation would work in her favor when things went wrong. But now that it had, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt something deeper, an overwhelming sense of justice. This was about more than just her. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their skin, their age, or appearance. Mr. Morton stood tall and silent for a moment, his eyes locked on the pilot. Finally, he spoke, his voice laced with cold authority. "You will never set foot on another flight of mine again," he said, each word sharp and clear. The words hung in the air as the crew, the gate staff, and Captain Davies himself stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The realization that this man had the power to shut them down in an instant was enough to paralyze them all. Liana stepped forward, standing tall, her back straight. She felt no need to speak. Her father had already made everything clear. The weight of the situation was heavier than she had ever imagined, but she knew it was the beginning of something more significant. This wasn't just about her. It was about the way people saw others and how that perception could change with just a little power and courage. As Liana boarded the plane, her father by her side, she felt the stirrings of something much deeper, something that could shake the world if she wanted it to. And for the first time, Liana realized she had the power to change the course of things, just like her father. As Liana and her father made their way through the narrow passage toward the first-class cabin, a quiet sense of finality settled over them. The flight attendants, now visibly anxious, hurried to prepare the cabin for takeoff. The hum of the airplane's engines began to rise in the background, vibrating through the floor and walls. But to Liana, it seemed distant. Her thoughts were elsewhere, swirling with the events that had just unfolded. The captain's refusal had been the catalyst, but it was her father's arrival that had truly changed everything. As Liana took her seat, the plush leather cushion under her felt suddenly heavy, like an anchor holding her in place. The window beside her offered a view of the airport runway, the planes lined up, ready to soar into the sky. But her thoughts were not on the flight or the destinations. They lingered on the look in Captain Davies's eyes when he'd realized who she was. The shock, the realization that he had just made an unforgivable mistake. Mr. Morton sat beside her, his presence immediately comforting yet imposing. He adjusted the cufflinks on his shirt, his movements deliberate, measured, as if the entire world was still waiting for him to make his next move. Liana watched him closely, trying to gauge his mood. Her father was always calm, always composed, traits that many of his business associates admired and feared in equal measure. He had been through many high-pressure situations, faced many adversaries, but Liana had never seen him this still, this quiet. He had yet to say a word since they sat down, and Liana's nerves grew as the silence stretched on. It wasn't like him to remain quiet for so long. Liana knew him well enough to understand that when her father was silent, it meant he was thinking, calculating. She wasn't sure if he was still processing the way Captain Davies had treated her, or if he was already planning the consequences. "Are you okay, Liana?" her father asked finally, his voice low but warm. He looked over at her, his dark eyes softening with concern. Liana nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Dad. It didn't feel right." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Why didn't he believe me? Why did he treat me like that? Her father's gaze hardened, and for a split second, Liana could see the fire that burned inside him. It was the same fire that had driven him to build his empire from nothing. The same fire that made people both respect and fear him. He wasn't angry at her, but at the world that had made her feel small. "He judged you before knowing you, Liana. That's the mistake he made." He paused, his eyes distant, as if seeing the whole situation from a broader perspective. "It's a mistake many people make. They see someone and think they know everything about them. They let appearances, skin color, age, gender make decisions for them. But they don't know the truth. You, my daughter, are far more than they could ever imagine." Liana looked at her father, the words sinking in. She had always known he was different, that he saw the world in a way that most others couldn't. But hearing him speak about how people judged based on surface-level assumptions filled her with a deep sense of understanding. The feeling of being overlooked, underestimated, it was something she had lived with her whole life, even if it wasn't always as blatant as it had been with Captain Davies. "But what now, Dad?" Liana asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens to him?" Mr. Morton sat back, folding his arms in thought. His eyes scanned the interior of the cabin as if he were weighing the consequences, not just for Captain Davies, but for everyone who had ever doubted or mistreated his daughter. There was a shift in the air, a shift in how Liana began to view the world around her. She had always admired her father's ability to take control, to turn situations into opportunities. But now, she was starting to understand the deeper, more complicated layers beneath his calm demeanor. Justice, Liana, is not just about what happens next. It's about making sure the wrongs are righted, he said, his voice steady but firm. When someone takes away your dignity, they must face the consequences. And those consequences don't always come immediately. But trust me, Captain Davies will learn that there are consequences to his actions. Liana nodded. Her heart still felt heavy, but she understood. She had seen her father take down bigger adversaries, deal with more dangerous people. But now she was realizing that his justice wasn't just about power. It was about making the world see things for what they really were. It was about making people understand that no one, no matter who they were or what they owned, could push someone else down without facing repercussions. As the plane began its ascent, rising above the clouds, Liana's thoughts shifted. The city below was growing smaller, the buildings turning into specks of dust. She watched the ground fade away, her mind still processing the events. The truth of what had happened with Captain Davies, the rejection, the humiliation, was now sitting heavily in her chest. But with it, there was something else, a sense of clarity, of empowerment, that had grown within her over the course of this flight. She didn't have to prove anything to anyone. She didn't have to fight for validation. It wasn't about her father's wealth or status that made her who she was. It was about what she had inside, what she could achieve with her own strength. But it was also about using the privilege she had to ensure that others didn't experience the same injustice. And it was then, at that very moment, as the plane climbed higher and higher into the sky, that Liana made a quiet, resolute vow. She would never let the world define her by its prejudices. She would make her own path. She would fight for herself and for others like her, no matter how small the fight seemed in the moment. As the flight continued, Mr. Morton leaned over to Liana, his hand resting on her shoulder in a rare, intimate gesture. His eyes met hers with an understanding that only a father could have. "You're stronger than you know, Liana, and you will go far in this world. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Liana smiled, the weight of everything beginning to lift from her shoulders. It was a quiet affirmation, but it was all she needed. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The flight was long, but the hours seemed to drift by like the soft clouds outside the window. Liana was unusually quiet, her small hands folded neatly in her lap as she stared out at the ever-expanding horizon. The sky stretched infinitely, a deep blue canvas with scattered clouds that looked like cotton balls suspended in the air. But Liana's mind was not on the beauty of the view. Her thoughts were heavy, tangled with questions that kept swirling around, refusing to be ignored. The more she thought about what had happened at the airport, the more she realized that Captain Davies wasn't just another person who had made a mistake. He was a representation of something much larger, something that had existed long before her, something that had affected people in ways she didn't fully understand yet. It was the way people looked at her, judged her before they even knew her. It was the way the world seemed to decide her worth based on her skin color, her age, her gender. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push away the suffocating feeling that was building in her chest. The injustice of it all. It wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Liana could sense it now, as she sat in her plush first-class seat. With the airplane humming steadily beneath her, she could feel the invisible walls that separated her from others, that placed labels on her without any understanding of who she truly was. Her father, Mr. Morton, noticed her silence. He had been watching her for the past few minutes, noting the way her brows furrowed and the distant look in her eyes. It wasn't like her to be so withdrawn, especially not after everything that had happened. He leaned toward her, breaking the stillness of the moment. "Liana," he said, his voice soft but firm, as if reaching into the depths of her thoughts. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Liana hesitated. She wasn't sure how to put everything into words, how to explain the weight that was pressing on her heart. But she trusted her father more than anyone in the world. So, after a long pause, she spoke. "Dad," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do people treat me like that? Like I'm less than them, just because of who I am?" She paused, searching for the right words, the words that would make sense of the confusion swirling in her chest. "It's not just Captain Davies. It's the way people look at me, like I don't belong, like I'm invisible until they see my father's name or the color of my skin." Mr. Morton listened carefully, his eyes studying her as if weighing each word. He had always known that Liana would face challenges like these, but hearing her express her pain, her realization of the world's cruel tendencies, stirred something deep inside him. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I know it's hard to understand now, Liana," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But the truth is, people don't always see you for who you are. They see what they expect to see. They see what they want to see. It's their own limitations, their own insecurities that make them act that way. But that doesn't define you." Liana turned her gaze to her father. His words were comforting, but they didn't quite dissolve the deep ache she felt inside. "But it does define me, doesn't it? It defines how I'm treated, how people will always see me." Her voice caught on the last word, the bitterness creeping in for the first time in their conversation. Mr. Morton's expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability passing through his eyes. He took a deep breath, choosing his next words carefully. "People are scared of what they don't understand," he said. "They are scared of what doesn't fit into their narrow view of the world. But you, Liana, you have the power to change that. You don't have to let their ignorance shape your story. You don't have to let them make you small." The words settled in the space between them. Liana could feel the weight of them, the gravity of what her father was telling her. She wanted to believe him. She did believe him. But the truth was that believing in something was much harder than simply knowing it. The rest of the flight passed quietly. Liana spent the remainder of the time gazing out the window, her thoughts far away, processing everything her father had said. She felt a quiet stirring inside, a mix of anger and hope. She knew she was stronger than the way people treated her. She knew she could do something about it. But what? She was just a child who at times felt as though she was being crushed by the weight of the world's assumptions. As the plane began its descent, a subtle shift took place within Liana. The questions, the pain, the confusion, they all began to coalesce into something more. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she could feel it, an ember starting to burn in her chest. Her father's words had planted a seed, but Liana knew she would have to water it herself. She couldn't rely on anyone else to fight her battles. This was her fight, and somehow, she would find a way to win. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, bringing Liana back to reality. As the wheels hit the tarmac and the plane slowly rolled toward the terminal, her thoughts turned back to the life she was returning to, one of wealth, privilege, and influence. But for the first time, Liana wasn't just thinking about the advantages it gave her. She was thinking about the people who didn't have what she had, the people who were overlooked, judged, and dismissed every single day. As they disembarked from the plane, Mr. Morton took Liana's hand, his grip firm and comforting. He looked down at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're not alone in this, Liana. You never will be," he said, his voice low but filled with promise. Liana nodded, her heart lightened by his words, but still heavy with the knowledge that the world was not kind to those who didn't fit its narrow standards. But something had changed within her. There was a quiet fire now burning in her chest. She would not be a passive observer in this world. She would not wait for someone else to act on her behalf. For the first time, Liana understood what it meant to truly stand up for herself, not just in the moments when she was pushed, but in every moment after. And as she walked beside her father toward the airport exit, she knew her journey was just beginning. Her story, her fight, was about to unfold, and she would make sure that no one could silence her voice, not anymore. The heavy, humid air of the city wrapped itself around Liana and her father as they stepped out of the airport, the bustling noise of the busy streets filling the air. The sounds of honking horns, shouting vendors, and the rustling of busy pedestrians created a sharp contrast to the quiet, controlled atmosphere inside the airplane. For a moment, Liana felt disoriented. The shift from the calm of the sky to the frenzy of the city was almost too much to absorb. She looked up at her father, who had already hailed a black SUV that waited for them by the curb. His eyes were calm, his movements deliberate, as if nothing had happened, as if the incident with Captain Davies were already a distant memory. But Liana knew it wasn't. For her father, everything that happened had a weight, a consequence, even if he didn't always show it. As they slid into the back of the SUV, Liana leaned back against the plush leather seats, her mind still reeling. The sounds of the city faded to a dull hum in the background, and she found herself staring out of the window, watching the cityscape blur past. "Dad," she said after a long silence, her voice breaking through the stillness like a soft whisper. "What happens now?" Her father didn't look at her right away. He stared ahead, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. Liana could tell that he was deep in thought, but there was something about the way he held himself, his confidence, his control, that told her he wasn't worried. He had already made up his mind. "Liana," he began, his voice steady, "you've learned something today. People will try to diminish you. They'll try to define you by their own narrow views of the world. But you can't let that define who you are. What happened today with Captain Davies, it was wrong. But it's not just about him. It's about something much bigger than that." Liana nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood what he meant. Her father often spoke in riddles, layering his words with meanings that weren't always immediately clear. But something in his tone made her want to listen more closely. "You're going to face challenges, Liana, every day of your life," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly as if choosing his words carefully. "But you don't have to fight every battle the same way. You don't always have to be loud. You don't have to be angry. You just have to be smart. You have to understand the power you hold, your voice, your influence, and use it when the time is right." The words hung in the air, each one weighted with the kind of wisdom only someone who had lived through the toughest battles could offer. Liana sat quietly, digesting his words, letting them settle inside her like a slow-moving current. The SUV stopped in front of their sprawling estate, the tall iron gates swinging open as they drove through. The house loomed ahead, grand and imposing, an architectural marvel nestled among lush gardens. But Liana didn't see the beauty in it at that moment. Instead, she felt a strange heaviness in her chest as she looked up at the stone facade. The house was a symbol of everything her father had worked for, everything he had built. But it also felt like a reminder of the distance between her and the world outside. The car slowed to a stop in front of the grand entrance, and the driver opened the door for them. As Liana stepped out, she glanced around at the quiet, perfectly manicured grounds. The silence in the air was almost suffocating. The estate was her home, a place where she was both protected and isolated, and in that moment, it felt like a prison. Her thoughts wandered back to Captain Davies in the airport. She wondered how long it would take for word to get out about what had happened. She could already picture the headlines, the murmurs of disbelief from the people who had witnessed it all. Would they be talking about her father's response, about the consequences? Or would they simply forget, dismissing the incident as another day in the life of the rich and powerful? Her father stepped up beside her, his presence grounding her. "You're thinking too much," he said quietly, his tone gentle but knowing. Liana met his gaze, her thoughts still a tangled mess. "I can't help it. I keep wondering why people can't see me for who I am. Why they just assume things about me. It's like I don't even get a chance." Her father didn't answer right away. Instead, he led her inside the house, through the grand marble entryway, past the tall columns, and into the expansive living room. The space was quiet, vast, almost too perfect in its beauty. Liana knew that this was a world few people would ever understand, a world of privilege and power that came with its own set of rules. But there was a part of her that wasn't sure she wanted to be a part of it anymore, not if it meant she would always be judged, always be scrutinized simply because of who she was. Later that evening, after dinner, Liana found herself sitting alone in the expansive library, a place she often retreated to when her mind was too full. The large windows overlooked the sprawling garden, and she could see the faint glow of the moon casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured hedges. It was beautiful, but tonight it felt lonely. She picked up a book from the shelf, one of her favorites, but she couldn't focus on the words. Her mind kept drifting back to the airport, to the captain's dismissive attitude, to the way the other passengers had looked away, pretending not to see what was happening. She thought about what her father had said, about using her voice, about understanding her power, but a part of her felt unsure. Did she even know how to use it? Did she know what it meant to truly speak up and demand change? The weight of the world was heavy on her shoulders. The anger she felt was real, but it wasn't the kind that would go away with just a few comforting words from her father. It was the kind of anger that simmered beneath the surface, the kind that would stay with her as she grew older. But it was also the kind of anger that could be channeled into something powerful if she learned how to direct it. She set the book aside, standing up and walking to the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond the walls of the estate, a world where people like her still had to fight for recognition, for respect, for a place at the table. A world where she would need to find her voice, her place in the narrative. Liana took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air wash over her as she gazed out into the distance. She didn't know how yet, but she knew one thing. Her journey was just beginning. The battles ahead would be harder, more complicated, and there would be moments of doubt. But there was a part of her that was ready to face it all, ready to use whatever power she had to fight for herself and for those who would never have the chance to stand up. For the first time, Liana felt the fire inside her growing stronger. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had been made to feel small. She would fight for them, and in doing so, she would find her own voice. The days following the incident at the airport passed in a haze for Liana. Each day she woke to the same grand house, the same bustling life her father had built for them. Yet, she felt the weight of the world press on her more heavily than ever before. The mansion that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a gilded cage, beautiful and secure, but confining, suffocating in its isolation. She spent most of her time in the sprawling garden behind the house, surrounded by towering trees and immaculately trimmed hedges. The quiet hum of the outside world seemed distant from here, far removed from the chaos that had erupted inside her mind ever since that day at the airport. Liana had always known that people were judged by their appearance, but she had never realized how quickly those judgments could be made and how deep they could cut. Despite her father's reassuring words, despite his promise that she could rise above it all, Liana found herself wrestling with the way she now saw the world. She could no longer pretend that it was as simple as being strong and rising above. The world was messy, full of contradictions, and the people who ruled it, the ones who had the power to shape perceptions, didn't always have the answers. And no matter how much she tried to convince herself that her father was right, that she had the power to change things, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. What good was power if you didn't know how to wield it? What good was fighting when you didn't even know where to start? It was late afternoon when Liana found herself sitting by the fountain in the garden, the sound of the water cascading over stones soothing yet distant. The sunlight filtered through the branches of the trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting there, lost in thought, when she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to find her father standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable as always. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, watching her, until Liana sighed and looked down at her hands. "Dad," she began quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "What am I supposed to do with all of this? All these feelings, this anger? I don't know where to put it." Her father took a step closer and sat down beside her, the space between them filled with unspoken understanding. He didn't rush to speak, as if giving her the space she needed to process her emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "You don't need to have all the answers right now, Liana," he said, his tone gentle. "Not everything can be figured out in one moment. Some things you learn as you go. But the anger, the frustration you're feeling, that's not something you bury. It's not something you ignore. It's real, and it's yours. But you have to decide what you want to do with it." Liana turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I feel like everything's so out of control. Like nothing I do will matter. Like no one will ever really see me for who I am." Her father gave her a long, measured look, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of tenderness and wisdom. "It's not just about being seen, Liana. It's about how you see yourself. The world can try to define you, to label you, to push you into a box. But you have to decide who you are. You have to decide what you stand for, what you want to change, and what you're willing to fight for." Liana's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel like she had the strength to rise above it all. But the truth was, the uncertainty gnawed at her, making it hard to see the way forward. "But how?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "How do I fight something that's so big? I'm just one person, one kid. What difference can I make?" Her father leaned back, crossing his arms, his gaze distant for a moment, as if he were seeing beyond the horizon. He let out a soft sigh before turning back to her. "You start small. You start by deciding what matters to you, what you believe in. You fight for those things, even if it's just one person at a time." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "And you don't have to do it alone. You have people who believe in you, people who have your back. But it starts with you. You have to be willing to step up, even when it's hard, even when it seems like no one else will." Liana's chest tightened as her father's words sank in. She had always known that she would one day be expected to follow in his footsteps, to live up to his expectations. But this was different. This wasn't about building an empire or accumulating wealth or power. This was about something deeper, something more personal. For the first time, Liana allowed herself to consider the possibility that her father's fight, his success, wasn't just about what he had built for himself. It was about the world he had shaped around him, the people he had touched, the opportunities he had given. His power wasn't just a tool for personal gain. It was a weapon he used to change the world, to make it more just, more equitable. But that kind of power required something more than just strength. It required conviction, and it required courage. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her father's words settle in her bones. "I'm scared, Dad," she admitted, her voice trembling. "What if I try and fail? What if nothing changes?" Her father's gaze softened, and for the first time, Liana saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "You won't know unless you try, Liana. And if you fail, you'll get back up. But you can't live your life wondering what could have been. You have to live it by making decisions that matter." The evening sky turned a deep indigo as the two of them sat in the garden, the quiet night settling in around them. The world seemed vast and uncertain, but for the first time, Liana felt a sense of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure where her journey would take her. But she knew one thing. She couldn't let fear hold her back. She couldn't let the weight of the world's judgment crush her before she even had a chance to stand tall. She turned to her father, her voice steady now. "I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm ready to try. I'm ready to figure out how to fight, how to make a difference." Her father's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "That's all I need to hear, Liana. The rest will come with time." And as they sat there together under the slowly fading stars, Liana felt something stir deep inside her, an ember that had been waiting to ignite. It wasn't just about fighting for herself anymore. It was about fighting for what was right, for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or denied their rightful place in the world. Her journey was just beginning, and this time, Liana Morton was ready to take the first step. Days turned into weeks, and Liana found herself slowly coming to terms with the new path she had begun to carve for herself. The mansion, the wealth, and the privilege of her family were no longer sources of comfort in the way they once had been. They were just pieces of the world that she had always known, surfaces that could easily be polished, but that hid the real work that needed to be done beneath. Each day she sat in the library or wandered through the garden, her mind no longer consumed by the heaviness of the world. There was a clarity there now, a quiet determination that had replaced the confusion and the uncertainty that once clouded her thoughts. She began reading books not about power and wealth, but about change, about justice, about the ways in which the world could be better. She read stories of people who had fought for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Her father watched her closely, and though he said little, he knew that something inside Liana had shifted. It wasn't just her decision to try. It was her willingness to learn, to understand, and to grow. The fire he had seen in her as a child, that quiet strength, was now being channeled into something far greater. And still, though she had found some peace in the quiet moments of reflection, Liana knew there was more. She couldn't hide from the world forever. She had to step into it. It was a crisp morning when Liana's decision became final. She had spent the night before wrestling with herself, questioning her purpose and how to begin. She knew that words alone would never be enough. Action was necessary, and it needed to be rooted in the kind of change that would echo far beyond her family's wealth and influence. She didn't need more power. She needed a purpose. That morning, as her father prepared to leave the house for another meeting with his board of directors, Liana made her way to his office. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her steps were firm. She had already made up her mind, but now she had to find the courage to say the words. Her father looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression unchanged, though there was a slight glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. He knew his daughter well enough to recognize the look on her face. She was ready. "What's on your mind, Liana?" he asked, his voice soft but commanding. She walked toward him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Dad, I want to do something that matters. I want to be more than just the daughter of Mr. Morton. I want to use what I have to make a difference." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he studied her. "What kind of difference?" he asked, his voice neutral but knowing. Liana took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling in her chest. "I want to create something that helps others see their own worth. I want to be the voice for those who are too afraid or too invisible to speak. I don't just want to fight for me. I want to fight for everyone who's been told they're not enough." Her father didn't speak right away. He let the silence hang between them, allowing her words to settle into the space. For a moment, Liana felt the weight of her own uncertainty, but then she saw the subtle shift in her father's expression, the faintest glimmer of pride in his eyes. He didn't have to say a word for her to know that he understood. "You've always had that strength, Liana," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. "But I want you to remember something. Making a difference isn't easy. It's a battle that will test you in ways you can't predict. You will be challenged, and there will be times when you want to quit. But you have to hold on to your purpose. Don't lose sight of why you started." Liana nodded, her heart beating with both excitement and fear. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, criticism, and moments of doubt. But there was something in her now, a belief that she could change something, and if not the world, at least her corner of it. "Thank you, Dad," she said quietly, the words simple but filled with meaning. She didn't need to say more. She didn't need to explain her resolve further. Her father had already understood. That day, Liana made her first steps into the world beyond her family's estate. She reached out to local communities, organizations, and schools, offering her time and resources to help amplify voices that had been ignored. She worked with activists and advocates, listening more than speaking, understanding that her role wasn't just to give, it was to learn and to act. The first few weeks were difficult. She encountered skepticism, challenges, and opposition. Some people saw her as a figurehead, a wealthy girl who could never truly understand the struggles of others. Others doubted her intentions, questioning whether her actions would amount to anything beyond a publicity stunt. But Liana was undeterred. She knew what her father had told her was true. The real work would be difficult. She couldn't change everything at once, but she could start with small actions. She worked with local schools to set up mentorship programs where older students could help younger ones navigate not only their academic challenges, but their personal struggles as well. She used her influence to fund community projects that provided resources to those who needed them most. The results were slow, but they were real. She began to see the impact of her work, not in grand gestures or headlines, but in the quiet conversations, the smiles of young children who finally felt seen, and the gratitude of those who had been given a chance. One evening, months later, Liana sat on the balcony of their estate, looking out over the city. It was quiet now, the kind of silence that made the world feel peaceful but heavy. The city below her was alive, bustling with energy, filled with people who were all living their lives, each one with their own stories, their own struggles. Liana's mind drifted back to the airport, to Captain Davies's dismissive gaze, and to the questions she had asked herself about where she belonged. She no longer felt the weight of uncertainty that had once filled her heart. She had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had found herself. Her father stepped onto the balcony beside her, standing silently for a moment before speaking. "You've come a long way, Liana." She looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "I still have a long way to go." He smiled back, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. "You'll get there, I have no doubt." Liana nodded, her heart full, her resolve stronger than ever. She had learned that the world was not kind to those who were different, to those who didn't fit the mold. But that didn't mean she had to conform. She didn't need to shrink to fit someone else's expectations. She could be herself, loud and unapologetic, and still make a difference. The journey was just beginning, but Liana knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid to walk it. With every step, she would make her voice heard, and she would make sure that no one, no matter who they were, would ever be invisible again. And with that, Liana Morton stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next with strength, with conviction, and with the knowledge that she had the power to change the world. And so, with her courage and determination, Liana found her voice and began to make a real difference. From that moment on, she understood that true change doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing up, speaking out, and fighting for what's right, no matter the obstacles. Her journey was just the beginning, and the world was already starting to see her for who she truly was, a force for change. If you were inspired by Liana's story and want to hear more about how small acts of bravery can lead to powerful transformations, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more stories that will challenge your perspective and ignite your passion for making a difference. Thank you for watching.